Marcus Thompson had lived in Willowbrook Gardens for 15 years. The quiet suburban neighborhood with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns had been his sanctuary after retiring from his career as a federal investigator. He chose this place specifically because it promised peace and community spirit. What he didn't expect was to become the target of a group of neighbors who had appointed themselves as the unofficial neighborhood police. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus was in his garage working on restoring a classic 1967 Mustang that he had bought as a retirement project. The garage door was open, and he was carefully sanding down some rust spots when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see 3 people walking up his driveway with serious expressions on their faces. The leader of the group was Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s who had moved to the neighborhood just 2 years ago, but acted like she owned the place. Behind her stood Bob Peterson, a tall man with a permanent scowl, and Linda Hayes, who always seemed to be looking for something to complain about. Marcus had noticed these 3 had been causing problems for other neighbors too, but he had managed to avoid any direct confrontations until now. Janet stepped forward with a clipboard in her hand and an official-looking badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. "Mr. Thompson," she said in a stern voice, "we're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. We've received multiple complaints about your activities here, and we need to conduct an inspection." Marcus set down his sandpaper and wiped his hands on a rag. He had been part of the real HOA board when he first moved in, and he knew for a fact that there hadn't been an active HOA in this neighborhood for over 8 years. The original board had dissolved due to lack of interest and funding. "I'm sorry, but there is no HOA in this neighborhood," he replied calmly. "The last one was disbanded years ago." Bob Peterson stepped forward aggressively. "That's where you're wrong, buddy. We reformed the HOA 6 months ago, and we have full authority to enforce the rules and regulations of this community." He pointed at the Mustang. "And that eyesore in your garage is violation number 1. Classic cars need to be stored out of sight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He had dealt with all kinds of people during his career, and he could smell a scam from a mile away. "Can I see your documentation?" Any legitimate HOA would have proper paperwork, bylaws, and legal registration with the county. Linda Hayes spoke up, her voice shrill and demanding. "We don't need to show you anything. We're the authority here, and you need to comply with our demands. This isn't just about the car. Your lawn was half an inch too high last week. You've been using the wrong shade of paint on your fence, and your garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 4 hours after pickup." The accusations were ridiculous, but Marcus could see they were serious about their fake authority. He had encountered similar situations during his investigating days, where people would create fake organizations to intimidate others or collect money illegally. "Interesting," he said, crossing his arms. "And what exactly do you want me to do about these alleged violations?" Janet consulted her clipboard dramatically. "First, you'll pay the accumulated fines of $800. Second, you'll move that car to a storage facility within 48 hours. Third, you'll re-landscape your entire front yard to meet our new community standards. And fourth, you'll attend our mandatory homeowner education seminar this Saturday at 9 a.m. sharp." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it all, but he kept his expression neutral. During his career, he had learned that the best way to deal with con artists was to let them reveal more about their scheme before shutting them down. "And if I refuse?" Bob's face turned red with anger. "Then we'll have no choice but to place a lien on your property and begin foreclosure proceedings. We have the legal right to enforce these regulations, and we're not afraid to use it." Now Marcus was genuinely curious about how far these people were willing to take their charade. He decided to play along for a bit longer. "That's quite a serious threat. I assume you have lawyers handling the legal aspects of this reformed HOA?" Linda nodded enthusiastically. "Of course we do. We're not some fly-by-night operation. We have connections with the county courthouse, real estate attorneys, and even local law enforcement. Some people in this neighborhood have already learned not to mess with us." This statement made Marcus's investigator instincts kick into high gear. If these people were targeting elderly or vulnerable neighbors with their fake authority, this had moved beyond a simple nuisance into potential criminal territory. "I see. And how many other homeowners have you successfully educated about these regulations?" Janet's eyes lit up with pride. "Oh, we've been very successful. Mrs. Chen paid her fines without any argument. The Johnson family completely redid their backyard after we explained the violations. And old Mr. Rodriguez has been very cooperative since we helped him understand his responsibilities. Marcus felt a surge of anger. Mrs. Chen was an elderly widow who lived on a fixed income. The Johnsons were a young couple with twin babies who were already struggling financially. And Mr. Rodriguez was in his 80s and had dementia. These imposters had been preying on the most vulnerable members of his community. Well, Marcus said, maintaining his calm demeanor, this is certainly a lot to process. I'll need some time to review all of this information and make sure I understand my obligations. Bob stepped closer, trying to intimidate him. You don't have time to think about it. We need your compliance today, or we start the legal proceedings tomorrow. And just so you know, we're authorized to make citizens' arrests if homeowners become belligerent or non-cooperative. Marcus almost smiled at that statement. A citizen's arrest required witnessing an actual crime, and even then, it was a risky legal move for civilians. These people clearly had no idea what they were talking about legally, but they were betting that their targets wouldn't know that either. I appreciate you taking the time to explain everything, Marcus said politely. Why don't you give me your contact information, and I'll get back to you by tomorrow with my decision. Janet handed him a business card that looked like it had been printed at home. Here's our information. Remember, Mr. Thompson, we're trying to maintain property values and community standards for everyone's benefit. Cooperation is much easier than the alternative. After the three imposters left, Marcus sat in his garage for a few minutes, thinking about what had just happened. These people had no idea they had just tried to intimidate someone who had spent 30 years investigating fraud, corruption, and organized crime. They also didn't realize that he still had contacts throughout law enforcement and the legal system. Marcus looked at their cheap business card and shook his head. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting. That evening, Marcus made his first phone call to Detective Sarah Williams at the county sheriff's office. Sarah had been his partner for 5 years before he retired, and they had maintained their friendship. She answered on the second ring. Marcus, how's retirement treating you? Sarah's voice was warm and familiar. It was going well until today, Marcus replied. I think I've stumbled onto something that might interest your fraud division. He explained the encounter with the fake HOA, describing each person and their claims in detail. Sarah's tone became serious. That's definitely fraud and possibly extortion if they're collecting money from people. Do you think they've actually gotten money from your neighbors? I'm certain of it, Marcus said. They mentioned specific neighbors by name, including an elderly woman with dementia and a young couple with babies. Sarah, these people are targeting the most vulnerable residents in the community. Okay, here's what we'll do, Sarah said. I'll start a case file and begin some background checks on these three. Can you do some informal investigating in your neighborhood? Talk to the people they mentioned and see if you can document what's been happening. Marcus agreed and spent the rest of the evening planning his approach. He had learned long ago that successful investigations required patience, careful documentation, and building trust with victims who might be embarrassed about being scammed. The next morning, Marcus decided to start with Mrs. Chen. He had always liked the elderly woman, who kept beautiful flower gardens and often shared vegetables from her garden with neighbors. He found her outside watering her plants, but she seemed nervous and distracted. Good morning, Mrs. Chen, Marcus said gently. Your roses are looking beautiful this year. She looked up with a worried expression. Oh, hello, Marcus. Thank you. But I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to keep them. The HOA says my garden is too elaborate and attracts too many bees. They want me to replace everything with simple grass. Marcus felt his anger rising again, but he kept his voice calm. Mrs. Chen, can you tell me more about this HOA? When did they contact you? Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her watering can. About 2 months ago, 3 people came to my door with official-looking papers. They said I owed fines for various violations around my property. They were very pushy and said if I didn't pay immediately, they would put a lien on my house. How much did they ask for? Marcus asked. $600, she whispered. I know it was probably too much, but I was scared. My late husband always handled these kinds of things, and I didn't want to lose my home. So I wrote them a check. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. Mrs. Chen lived on Social Security and a small pension. $600 was probably a significant portion of her monthly income. Mrs. Chen, I need to tell you something important. There is no legitimate HOA in this neighborhood. These people are scammers, and what they did to you was illegal. Her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and distress. But they seemed so official. They had badges and clipboards and everything. They said they were working with the county. It's all fake, Marcus assured her. I'm going to help you get your money back. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about these people, and keep any paperwork they gave you. Mrs. Chen invited him inside, where she showed him a folder filled with official-looking documents. Marcus examined them carefully. The papers were impressive to someone unfamiliar with legal documents, but to his trained eye, they were obviously fake. The letterhead was generic, the legal language was incorrect, and there were no proper case numbers or court seals. After documenting everything with Mrs. Chen, Marcus walked over to the Johnsons' house. He could hear babies crying inside when he knocked on the door. Amanda Johnson answered, looking exhausted and stressed. "Hi, Marcus," she said, trying to smile. "Sorry about the noise. The twins are teething and they haven't been sleeping well." "No problem at all," Marcus said. "I was wondering if I could talk to you and Mike about something. It's about some people who might have contacted you claiming to be from an HOA. Amanda's face immediately darkened. "Oh God, you mean those awful people. Please come in." She led him to the living room where Mike was walking around with one of the babies, trying to calm the crying child. Mike looked up when Marcus entered. "Let me guess, they came to your house too?" "Yesterday," Marcus confirmed. "But I'm here because I think they're running a scam and I want to help expose them." Amanda and Mike exchanged glances. "We were wondering about that," Amanda said. "The whole thing seemed sketchy, but they were so aggressive and threatening that we were afraid not to comply." Mike shifted the baby to his other arm. "They demanded we tear down the swing set we just built for when the kids get older. Said it violated some ridiculous setback regulation. Then they wanted us to re-fence our entire backyard with specific materials that would cost us thousands of dollars. And they wanted payment up front for processing fees," Amanda added. $1,500 just to review our compliance plan. We told them we didn't have that kind of money, and they got really nasty." Marcus was taking notes as they talked. "Did they threaten you with legal action?" "Worse than that," Mike said. "The big guy, Bob I think his name was, said that non-compliance was a criminal matter and that they had authority to have us arrested. He said our kids could be taken away if we were found to be unfit homeowners. The threat involving their children crossed a serious line. Marcus knew that making false threats about child protective services could be considered criminal intimidation. "Did you end up paying them anything?" "We gave them $300, Amanda said, tears forming in her eyes. "It was supposed to be money for the baby's daycare next month, but we were so scared. They made it sound like we could lose our house and our children if we didn't cooperate." Marcus spent another hour with the young couple, documenting their experience and collecting copies of the fake documents the scammers had provided. The materials were similar to what Mrs. Chen had received, but the demands were more expensive and the threats more severe. His final stop was Mr. Rodriguez's house. The elderly man's daughter Maria answered the door. She was visiting from out of state to help her father with some medical appointments. "Maria, I'm Marcus Thompson from down the street," he introduced himself. "I wanted to talk to you about some people who might have contacted your father about HOA issues." Maria's expression immediately became angry. "Don't even get me started on those people. They took advantage of my father's condition and scared him half to death." She explained that her father, who had moderate dementia, had been confused and frightened when the three scammers showed up at his door. They had convinced him that his house was going to be seized by the county, unless he paid immediate fines and signed documents agreeing to expensive property modifications. "He called me crying," Maria said. "He thought he was going to be homeless. These people are absolutely despicable. They saw an elderly man with cognitive issues and decided he was easy prey. Mr. Rodriguez had paid $800 and signed papers agreeing to replace his roof, repaint his entire house, and remove several mature trees from his yard. The total cost of the demanded improvements would have been over $20,000. As Marcus walked home that afternoon, he had a clear picture of what had been happening in his neighborhood. The fake HOA had collected at least $1,700 from his neighbors and had committed multiple felonies in the process. They had targeted vulnerable people, made false legal threats, and used intimidation tactics that crossed the line into criminal behavior. That evening, Marcus called Detective Williams again. "Sarah, it's worse than I thought. These people aren't just running a simple scam. They're systematically targeting elderly and vulnerable residents with elaborate fraud schemes. "What's your recommendation?" Sarah asked. "I think we need to set up a sting operation," Marcus said. "Let me arrange another meeting with them and we can catch them in the act of attempting to extort money and making false legal threats." Sarah agreed to the plan. "I'll coordinate with the district attorney's office. If these people think they can prey on elderly residents, they're about to learn a very expensive lesson." Marcus smiled grimly as he hung up the phone. Tomorrow's meeting with the fake HOA was going to be very different from what they expected. Marcus woke up early the next morning and spent time preparing for what would likely be the most satisfying conversation of his retirement. He had arranged to meet with Detective Williams and Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park at 8 a.m. to finalize the details of their operation. The plan was straightforward, but effective. Marcus would contact the fake HOA and request a follow-up meeting, claiming he wanted to discuss payment options for his violations. Detective Williams would be positioned nearby with recording equipment, and 2 unmarked patrol units would be standing by in case the situation escalated. At 9 a.m., Marcus called the number on the business card Janet had given him. She answered after 3 rings, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association. Janet speaking. How can I help you today?" "Janet, this is Marcus Thompson. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to discuss the violations you mentioned. Could we meet again this afternoon?" "Oh, wonderful." Janet's excitement was obvious. "I'm so glad you're taking a reasonable approach to this, Marcus. We can definitely work something out. How about 2 o'clock at your house?" "Actually, I'd prefer to meet somewhere more neutral," Marcus said. "How about the gazebo in Willowbrook Park? It's public, and we can discuss everything openly." Janet agreed, though she sounded slightly disappointed that they wouldn't be able to pressure him in the privacy of his own home. Marcus spent the rest of the morning reviewing his notes and mentally preparing for the confrontation. At 1:30, Detective Williams arrived at Marcus's house in an unmarked car. She was wearing casual clothes and carrying a small bag that contained sophisticated recording equipment. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked as she set up the recording device. "These people might get aggressive when they realize what's happening." Marcus smiled. "Sarah, I've dealt with drug dealers, organized crime figures, and white-collar criminals who were a lot more dangerous than these 3 neighborhood bullies. Besides, I'm looking forward to seeing their faces when they realize who they've been trying to scam." At exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus walked to the park gazebo. Detective Williams positioned herself at a picnic table about 50 yards away, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid being noticed. The recording equipment would capture everything from that distance. Janet, Bob, and Linda arrived 5 minutes late, walking across the park with their fake official materials and exaggerated sense of authority. Janet was carrying a larger folder this time, probably filled with more intimidating fake documents. "Marcus," Janet called out as they approached. "I'm so pleased you decided to be reasonable about this situation. Cooperation always makes things easier for everyone involved." Bob was scowling as usual, but Linda seemed particularly excited about the prospect of collecting money from another victim. They arranged themselves around the picnic table in the gazebo, with Marcus sitting across from the 3 scammers. "Before we begin," Marcus said calmly, "I want to make sure I understand exactly what authority you're claiming to have. You said you reformed the HOA for this neighborhood?" "That's absolutely correct," Janet replied, opening her folder and pulling out what looked like official bylaws. "We followed all the proper legal procedures and filed the appropriate paperwork with the county. We have full authority to enforce community standards and collect fines for violations." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And you said you've been working with other neighbors to resolve similar issues?" "Oh yes," Linda jumped in eagerly. "We've been very successful in helping people understand their responsibilities. Mrs. Chen was so grateful for our guidance, and the Rodriguez family has been very cooperative." Bob leaned forward aggressively. "The bottom line is simple, Thompson. You pay the fines, fix the violations, and follow the rules, or we move forward with legal action. We're not running a charity here." "I see," Marcus said. "And what specific legal action are you threatening?" Janet consulted her fake documents. "We can place liens on non-compliant properties, initiate foreclosure proceedings, and work with local law enforcement to address criminal violations of community standards." "Criminal violations?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Absolutely," Bob said. Willful violation of HOA regulations is a misdemeanor offense, and we're authorized to make citizens' arrests when necessary. Marcus had heard enough. These people were not only committing fraud, but they were also making false claims about having law enforcement authority. It was time to end this charade. That's very interesting, Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Because I've done some research since yesterday, and I've discovered some fascinating things about your operation. The three scammers exchanged nervous glances, but Janet tried to maintain her authoritative facade. What kind of research? Well, for starters, I contacted the county clerk's office and confirmed that there is no registered HOA for this neighborhood. The last one was dissolved 8 years ago, and no new organization has been filed. Linda's face was starting to turn pale, but Bob tried to bluster his way through. That's impossible. We have all the proper documentation. Marcus pulled out a folder of his own filled with real legal documents he had obtained that morning. I also contacted the state attorney general's office about unlicensed organizations claiming legal authority. Apparently, impersonating official organizations and making false legal threats are serious felonies. Janet's confident demeanor was cracking. Now wait just a minute. We're trying to help this community, and if there were some technical filing errors, those can be corrected. Technical filing errors. Marcus's voice was getting louder. You've been extorting money from elderly residents, making false legal threats, and claiming authority you don't have. Mrs. Chen paid you $600 she couldn't afford. The Johnson family gave you $300 meant for their baby's daycare, and you terrified Mr. Rodriguez, who has dementia, into paying $800. Bob stood up aggressively. You don't know what you're talking about, old man. And you're starting to piss me off. Marcus remained seated, completely calm. Sit down, Bob. You're already in enough trouble without adding assault to the list of charges. Charges? Linda squeaked. What charges? We haven't done anything illegal. Marcus smiled coldly. Fraud, extortion, impersonating officials, making false legal threats, targeting vulnerable adults, and conspiracy. Those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. Janet was frantically shuffling through her fake papers. You can't prove any of this. It's your word against ours. Actually, it's not, Marcus said, pulling out his cell phone. This entire conversation has been recorded, and you've just confessed to multiple felonies on tape. The three scammers looked around wildly, suddenly realizing they might be in serious trouble. Bob started to back away from the table. This is entrapment. You can't record people without their permission, Marcus laughed. Bob, we're in a public park and you're not under arrest. Anyone can record conversations in public spaces. But since you brought up arrests... He raised his hand and made a subtle signal. Detective Williams appeared from behind them, her badge visible and her hand resting on her handcuffs. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Detective Sarah Williams with the County Sheriff's Office, and you're all under arrest for fraud and extortion. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Linda screamed and tried to run, but another officer appeared from the trees to block her path. Janet dropped her folder and fake documents scattered across the ground. Bob tried to argue, but his voice cracked as he demanded to see warrants and threatened to sue everyone. You have the right to remain silent, Detective Williams continued, beginning to read them their Miranda rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the three scammers were being handcuffed, Marcus stood up and collected the fake documents they had dropped. By the way, he said to Janet, you might want to know that I'm a retired federal investigator with 30 years of experience dealing with people exactly like you. Janet's face went completely white. Federal investigator? That's right, Marcus replied. I specialized in fraud, corruption, and organized crime. Did you really think you could run this kind of operation in my neighborhood without me noticing? Bob was still trying to bluster even as he was being led toward the patrol car. This is harassment. We're legitimate business people. Detective Williams turned to Marcus as the suspects were loaded into the vehicles. That was perfect. We got everything we need on tape, plus they incriminated themselves even further with their statements. Marcus watched as the three cars drove away, taking the fake HOA members to jail. What happens now? Now we contact all their victims and help them get their money back, Sarah said. And these three will be facing serious felony charges. They picked the wrong neighborhood to run their scam. As Marcus walked home, he felt a deep satisfaction. Not only had he stopped the scammers from targeting more victims, but he had also ensured that Mrs. Chen, the Johnson family, and Mr. Rodriguez would get justice. Sometimes retirement had its perks, especially when you could use your old skills to protect your community. Fake HOA had no idea who they were dealing with, but now they were about to find out just how serious the consequences of their actions would be. The next morning, Marcus woke up to find his phone buzzing with missed calls and text messages. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about the arrests, and many residents wanted to know what had happened. Some were relieved, others were shocked, and a few were angry that they had been victimized by the scammers. Detective Williams called him at 8 a.m. with an update. "Marcus, you're not going to believe what we found when we searched their homes and vehicles. This operation was much bigger than we initially thought." Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his kitchen chair. "How much bigger?" "They had files on over 30 families in 4 different neighborhoods," Sarah explained. "They weren't just targeting Willowbrook Gardens. They had fake HOA operations running in Sunset Hills, Maple Ridge, and Oakwood estates. We estimate they've collected over $15,000 in fake fines and fees over the past 6 months." Marcus felt his anger rising again. These weren't just opportunistic neighbors causing trouble. They were organized criminals running a sophisticated fraud operation across multiple communities. "Have you been able to contact all the victims?" "We're working on it," Sarah said. "But here's the interesting part. We found evidence that they were planning to expand their operation significantly. They had researched at least 10 more neighborhoods and were looking into creating fake utility companies and false property inspection services." The scope of the planned crimes was staggering. Marcus realized that if they hadn't been stopped, these 3 could have defrauded hundreds of families out of thousands of dollars. "What about their backgrounds? Any prior criminal history?" "That's where it gets really interesting," Sarah continued. "Janet Morrison has 2 previous convictions for fraud in other states. Bob Peterson has a history of intimidation and assault charges, and Linda Hayes was involved in a pyramid scheme that targeted elderly investors 3 years ago." Marcus shook his head in disgust. These were career criminals who had specifically chosen to target vulnerable populations. The fact that they had moved their operation to his quiet neighborhood made him feel personally responsible for stopping them. "There's something else," Sarah added. "When we interviewed them separately, they all tried to blame each other and claim they were just following orders. But we also discovered that they had been planning to recruit other people to help expand their fake HOA operations." "Recruit other people?" "They had a whole business model worked out," Sarah explained. "They were going to train other teams to run similar scams in suburban neighborhoods across the state. They saw this as a low-risk, high-profit criminal enterprise because most victims are too embarrassed or scared to report the crimes." Marcus spent the rest of the morning fielding calls from neighbors and organizing a community meeting for that evening. People wanted answers, and many were discovering that they had been approached by the fake HOA but had avoided becoming victims through luck or suspicion. At 2 p.m., Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park called him directly. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to personally thank you for your work on this case. Because of your investigation and the evidence you helped gather, we're able to file very serious charges against all 3 defendants." "What kind of charges are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "Each of them is facing multiple felony counts," Jennifer explained. "Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, targeting vulnerable adults, and impersonating officials. With their prior criminal histories, they're looking at significant prison time if convicted." Marcus was pleased to hear that the legal system was taking the crime seriously. "What about restitution for the victims?" "That's guaranteed," Jennifer assured him. "We've already frozen their bank accounts and identified assets that can be seized to compensate the people they defrauded. Every victim will get their money back plus interest and damages." That evening, Marcus hosted a neighborhood meeting in the community center. Over 60 residents attended, including many he had never met before. Mrs. Chen, the Johnson family, and Maria Rodriguez, representing her father, all came to share their experiences and thank Marcus for his help. Marcus stood at the front of the room and addressed the crowd. "I want everyone to understand what happened here and how we can prevent it from happening again. These 3 individuals were not legitimate HOA representatives. They were career criminals running an organized fraud operation." He explained how the scam worked, what red flags to watch for, and how residents could verify the legitimacy of any organization claiming authority over their properties. "The most important thing to remember is that legitimate HOAs have proper legal documentation, registered bylaws, and transparent financial records. They don't threaten immediate legal action or demand cash payments. An elderly man in the back raised his hand. Marcus, how did you know they were fake? They seem so official, Marcus smiled. 30 years as a federal investigator taught me to recognize con artists. They had several tells that gave them away. First, they were too aggressive and demanded immediate compliance. Second, their legal threats didn't make sense. Third, they targeted the most vulnerable people in the community instead of addressing real community issues. Amanda Johnson stood up with tears in her eyes. Marcus, I can't thank you enough for what you did. These people made us feel like we were bad parents and homeowners. They scared us into thinking we could lose our children and our home. Several other victims shared similar stories. The scammers had used fear, intimidation, and fake authority to manipulate people into paying money they couldn't afford. Many residents admitted they had been approached but had been too suspicious or stubborn to comply with the demands. Mrs. Chen spoke last, her voice shaky but determined. I was so embarrassed that I fell for their tricks. But Marcus helped me understand that being a victim of crime doesn't make you stupid or weak. It makes you human. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Marcus privately to share additional information about suspicious activities they had noticed. It turned out that the 3 scammers had been conducting surveillance on the neighborhood for weeks before beginning their operation, identifying which residents might be most vulnerable to their tactics. Detective Williams attended the meeting and provided updates on the criminal case. I want everyone to know that this investigation is ongoing. We're working with law enforcement in other counties to identify additional victims and prevent these individuals from targeting other communities. She also announced that the district attorney's office was using this case as a model for training other investigators about organized fraud schemes targeting residential communities. Your neighborhood's experience is helping law enforcement across the state learn how to recognize and stop these types of crimes. Over the following weeks, Marcus continued to receive updates about the case. The 3 defendants had been denied bail due to their flight risk and criminal histories. Their court-appointed attorneys were struggling to develop a defense strategy because the evidence against them was overwhelming. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered a network of similar scams operating in other parts of the state. Law enforcement agencies were sharing information and coordinating efforts to shut down the entire criminal organization. Marcus also learned that the fake HOA operation had been generating detailed profiles of potential victims. They had specifically targeted neighborhoods with high percentages of elderly residents, young families, and people who might be unfamiliar with HOA regulations. Their victim selection process was coldly calculated and showed the sophisticated nature of their criminal enterprise. The local newspaper picked up the story and ran a series of articles about the fake HOA scam. Marcus was interviewed and photographed. Though he tried to keep the focus on the victims and the importance of community vigilance rather than his own role in solving the case, the real heroes here are the neighbors, who came forward to report what happened to them. Marcus told the reporter, "It takes courage to admit you've been victimized, and their willingness to share their stories will help protect other people from similar scams." As the initial excitement died down, Marcus reflected on how the experience had changed his perspective on retirement. He had moved to Willowbrook Gardens seeking peace and quiet, but he had found something more valuable, a community worth protecting. The fake HOA imposters had made a critical error in targeting his neighborhood. They had no idea that their chosen victim was someone with the skills, experience, and determination to fight back effectively. Their criminal enterprise was about to face consequences they never could have imagined. 3 months after the arrests, Marcus received a call that made his morning coffee taste even better. Detective Williams was practically laughing with satisfaction as she delivered the news. "Marcus, you'll love this. Janet Morrison just accepted a plea deal that includes 15 years in prison, full restitution to all victims, and cooperation with our investigation into their broader criminal network." Marcus set down his coffee cup and smiled. 15 years? That's serious time. It gets better, Sarah continued. Bob Peterson and Linda Hayes are facing even stiffer sentences because they refuse to cooperate. Bob's looking at 20 years minimum and Linda could get 18. The judge made it clear that targeting vulnerable elderly residents was an aggravating factor that would increase their sentences. The plea deal meant that Janet would have to testify against her co-conspirators and provide detailed information about their methods, victim selection process, and plans for expanding their criminal operation. Her cooperation was already helping law enforcement agencies in other states identify and prosecute similar scams. "There's more good news," Sarah added. "We've recovered almost all of the money they stole, plus additional assets that will provide enhanced restitution to the victims. Mrs. Chen is getting back twice what she paid, and the Johnson family will receive enough to cover their daycare costs for 6 months. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that the victims would not only be made whole but would receive additional compensation for the trauma and stress they had endured. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about repairing the harm that had been done. Later that day, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Maria Rodriguez knocked on his door, accompanied by her father and carrying a large gift basket. "Marcus," Maria said with a warm smile, "my father wanted to personally thank you for what you did. He's been much more confident and happy since he learned that those terrible people were arrested." Mr. Rodriguez, despite his dementia, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. "You're a good man," he said simply, shaking Marcus's hand. "You protected our neighborhood." The gift basket contained homemade cookies, fresh vegetables from Mr. Rodriguez's garden, and a handwritten note from Maria, expressing the family's gratitude. Marcus was touched by the gesture, but he was even more pleased to see that Mr. Rodriguez seemed more relaxed and confident than he had in months. Over the following weeks, Marcus learned more details about the broader investigation that had grown from their neighborhood case. The fake HOA scam had been just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise that included fake utility inspections, bogus home security services, and fraudulent property assessments. The criminal network had been operating across 5 states and had defrauded hundreds of families out of an estimated $200,000. The investigation had led to 12 additional arrests and had shut down multiple fake companies that were targeting residential communities. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park invited Marcus to attend the sentencing hearings. "For the 3 defendants, your testimony about their impact on the community will be powerful for the judge to hear," she explained. "And I think the victims would appreciate having you there for support." The first sentencing hearing was for Janet Morrison. The courthouse was packed with victims from multiple neighborhoods, law enforcement officers, and media representatives. Marcus sat in the front row with Mrs. Chen, the Johnson family, and several other neighbors who had been targeted by the scam. When it was Marcus's turn to address the court, he stood and looked directly at Janet, who was seated at the defendant's table in an orange jail jumpsuit. Her confident arrogance had been replaced by a defeated, frightened expression. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "these defendants didn't just steal money from my neighbors. They stole their sense of security, their trust in their community, and their peace of mind. They deliberately targeted the most vulnerable members of our society and used sophisticated psychological manipulation to exploit their fears." He went on to describe the impact on each victim, emphasizing how the scammers had researched their targets and customized their approach to maximize the emotional and financial damage. "This wasn't a crime of opportunity," Marcus concluded. "It was a calculated predatory operation designed to cause maximum harm to innocent people." The judge listened intently to all the victim impact statements before delivering her sentence. "Ms. Morrison, you and your co-conspirators engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior that specifically targeted elderly and vulnerable residents. Your actions show a complete disregard for human dignity and the basic trust that holds communities together." Janet Morrison received 17 years in prison, 2 years more than the plea agreement had specified. The judge explained that the additional time reflected the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise and the psychological trauma inflicted on the victims. Bob Peterson's sentencing hearing, 2 weeks later, was even more dramatic. He had continued to maintain his innocence and had fired 3 different attorneys who advised him to accept a plea deal. His aggressive behavior in court only reinforced the judge's perception that he was unrepentant and dangerous. When Bob was given the opportunity to address the court, he made the mistake of blaming the victims for being too stupid to understand legitimate business practices. The comment caused audible gasps in the courtroom and visibly angered the judge. "Mr. Peterson," the judge said sternly, "your complete lack of remorse and your continued attempts to blame your victims demonstrate that you pose an ongoing threat to society. This court will ensure that you have a very long time to reflect on your actions. Bob Peterson received 25 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the guidelines. His parole eligibility wouldn't begin until he had served at least 15 years, meaning he would be in his 70s before he could even apply for release. Linda Hayes' sentencing was more subdued. She had attempted to distance herself from her co-conspirators and claimed that she had been coerced into participating in the scam. However, the evidence showed that she had been an enthusiastic participant who had specifically suggested targeting elderly residents with cognitive impairments. Her sentence of 20 years reflected her slightly lesser role in the leadership of the criminal enterprise, but the judge made it clear that targeting vulnerable adults was an aggravating factor that warranted serious punishment. After all 3 sentencing hearings were complete, Marcus felt a profound sense of closure. The criminal justice system had worked exactly as it should, holding the defendants accountable for their actions and providing meaningful consequences for their crimes. But more importantly, the investigation had led to systemic changes that would protect other communities from similar scams. Law enforcement agencies had developed new protocols for identifying and investigating fake HOA operations. Consumer protection agencies had created educational materials to help residents recognize and report fraudulent schemes. And neighborhood watch programs across the state had been trained to identify the warning signs of organized fraud, targeting residential communities. Marcus received a commendation letter from the state attorney general's office, recognizing his role in exposing and stopping the criminal enterprise. The letter noted that his investigation had led to the recovery of over $200,000 in stolen money and had prevented countless additional victims from being defrauded. Mrs. Chen framed a newspaper article about the case and gave it to Marcus as a thank you gift. "You saved our neighborhood," she wrote in a note attached to the frame. "But more than that, you showed us that someone cared enough to fight for what was right." The Johnson family invited Marcus to their twins' first birthday party, introducing him to their extended family as the man who protected our community. Amanda Johnson pulled him aside during the party to tell him that they had used the restitution money to set up college savings accounts for their children. As Marcus sat in his garage that evening, working on his restored Mustang, he reflected on how much his retirement had changed. He had thought his days of fighting crime and protecting people were over, but his neighborhood experience had shown him that retirement didn't mean the end of making a difference. The fake HOA imposters had made a critical miscalculation when they targeted Willowbrook Gardens. They had assumed they were dealing with ordinary residents who would be easily intimidated and manipulated. Instead, they had encountered someone with the skills, experience, and determination to expose their criminal operation and ensure they faced serious consequences for their actions. Justice had been served, the community was stronger, and Marcus had discovered that retirement could be just as fulfilling as his career had been, especially when it involved protecting the people he cared about most. 1 year after the arrests, Marcus was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning in his garage when he heard a familiar sound. Confident footsteps approaching his driveway. For a moment, his investigator instincts kicked in, but then he recognized the visitors and smiled. Detective Williams was walking up his driveway with a woman he didn't recognize, both carrying official-looking folders. But this time Marcus knew they were the real deal. "Morning, Marcus," Sarah called out cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, but I wanted to introduce you to someone special." The woman with Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Captain Rebecca Martinez with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Captain. What brings you to my humble garage?" Captain Martinez smiled. "Actually, we're here with a proposition that I think you'll find interesting. Your work on the fake HOA case has had a much bigger impact than you might realize." She went on to explain that Marcus's investigation had become a model case study for law enforcement agencies across the country. The methods he had used to identify the scam, document the crimes, and coordinate with law enforcement had been incorporated into training programs for detectives and consumer protection investigators. "More importantly," Captain Martinez continued, "your case helped us identify a nationwide pattern of similar scams. We've now documented fake HOA operations in 37 states, and we estimate that these criminal networks have defrauded elderly and vulnerable residents out of millions of dollars. Sarah picked up the explanation. The problem is that most law enforcement agencies don't have investigators with your specific expertise in organized fraud. Local police departments are great at handling traditional crimes, but these sophisticated scams require specialized knowledge. Marcus was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. And you think I might be able to help with that? Exactly, Captain Martinez said. We're creating a new task force to combat organized fraud targeting residential communities. We need experienced investigators who understand both the criminal tactics and the psychological impact on victims. The position would be part-time consulting work, allowing Marcus to maintain his retirement while using his skills to protect communities across the state. He would help train local law enforcement officers, review suspicious cases, and coordinate multi-jurisdictional investigations when fake HOA operations crossed county or state lines. The best part, Sarah added with a grin, is that you'd get to travel to different communities and teach people how to recognize and fight back against these scams. You'd be like a fraud-fighting superhero making house calls. Marcus laughed at the description, but he was genuinely intrigued by the opportunity. His experience with the Willowbrook Gardens case had shown him how satisfying it could be to use his professional skills to protect innocent people from sophisticated criminals. There's something else, Captain Martinez said. We've received approval to create a victim compensation fund specifically for elderly residents who have been targeted by fake HOA scams. Your case documentation will help us establish the criteria for eligibility and the process for recovering stolen money. Over the next hour, they discussed the details of the proposed task force and Marcus's potential role in it. The work would involve about 20 hours per week, with a mix of office-based research and field investigations. He would have access to state law enforcement resources and would work directly with district attorneys' offices to ensure that criminals faced appropriate charges. I have to ask, Marcus said, what happened to our 3 friends? Last I heard they were all appealing their sentences. Sarah's expression darkened. All 3 appeals were denied. Janet Morrison is currently serving her time at the State Women's Correctional Facility, where she's actually been helpful in identifying other inmates who were involved in similar scams. Bob Peterson is in maximum security after getting into fights with other prisoners, and Linda Hayes is in medium security, where she's apparently found religion and claims to be a changed person. Do you believe the religious conversion? Marcus asked. Let's just say I'll be more convinced when she starts volunteering to help fraud victims instead of writing letters asking for early release, Sarah replied. Captain Martinez added more context about the broader investigation. Since your case broke open, we've identified and prosecuted 47 individuals involved in fake HOA operations. We've recovered over $1.2 million in stolen money and prevented an estimated $3 million in additional fraud. The numbers were staggering, but Marcus was most interested in the human impact. How many families have been helped? Over 300 confirmed victims have received full restitution, and we estimate that our educational campaigns have prevented thousands of additional people from being victimized, Captain Martinez explained. Marcus spent the weekend thinking about the offer. The work would certainly be more engaging than his garage projects, and it would allow him to continue making a meaningful difference in people's lives. But he also valued his newfound peace and quiet in Willowbrook Gardens. On Monday morning, he called Captain Martinez to accept the position. When do I start? Actually, we'd like you to begin with a case that just came to our attention, she said. There's a fake utility inspection scam operating in 3 counties north of you. The criminals are using very similar tactics to your HOA case, but they're claiming to represent the gas company and demanding immediate payments for safety violations. Marcus felt his old investigator instincts stirring with excitement. Send me the files. I'll review them and let you know what resources we'll need. His first case with the task force turned out to be even more sophisticated than the fake HOA operation. The criminals had created fake utility company uniforms, official-looking vehicles, and even false identification badges. They were targeting elderly homeowners with claims that immediate gas line repairs were needed to prevent dangerous explosions. The scam was particularly insidious because it played on legitimate safety concerns. Many victims paid thousands of dollars for unnecessary repairs, while others were left with damaged gas lines that actually created real safety hazards. Marcus spent 2 weeks undercover in the targeted communities, posing as a potential victim while gathering evidence about the criminals' methods and identifying their leadership structure. His experience with the fake HOA case proved invaluable in recognizing the psychological, manipulation tactics and documenting the evidence needed for successful prosecutions. The investigation led to 8 arrests and the recovery of over $200,000 in stolen money. More importantly, it prevented dozens of additional families from being victimized and helped law enforcement agencies develop new protocols for investigating fake utility scams. Over the following months, Marcus worked on similar cases across the state. Each investigation taught him something new about the evolution of organized fraud targeting residential communities. The criminals were becoming more sophisticated, but they were also becoming more predictable as law enforcement agencies learned to recognize their patterns. His work with the task force also reconnected him with the victims from his original case. Mrs. Chen had become a volunteer with a local senior advocacy group, helping other elderly residents recognize and report scams. The Johnson family had started a neighborhood watch program that focused specifically on protecting vulnerable residents from fraud. Mr. Rodriguez, despite his dementia, had become something of a local celebrity for his role in exposing the fake HOA operation. His daughter Maria had created a simple checklist that he could use to evaluate anyone claiming official authority, helping him maintain his independence while staying protected from scammers. On the anniversary of the fake HOA arrests, the Willowbrook Gardens community organized a celebration in Marcus's honor. Over 100 neighbors attended the barbecue in the park where the original sting operation had taken place. Mrs. Chen presented Marcus with a plaque that read, "To Marcus Thompson, who taught us that retirement doesn't mean the end of fighting for what's right. Thank you for protecting our community and showing us the power of neighbors helping neighbors." As Marcus looked around at the faces of his neighbors, he realized that the fake HOA imposters had inadvertently given him the greatest gift of his retirement. They had shown him that his skills and experience could still make a meaningful difference in the world, and they had connected him to a community of people who truly cared about protecting each other. The scammers had thought they were dealing with easy targets in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Instead, they had encountered someone who understood that real strength comes from community, determination, and the willingness to fight for what's right. Marcus continued his work with the task force for several more years, helping to dismantle criminal networks and protect vulnerable residents across the state. But he never forgot the lesson he learned in his own neighborhood. Sometimes the most important battles are fought right in your own backyard, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who simply refuse to let injustice go unchallenged.